What would make an 8-year-old girl sell her best friend for $50? Jax Griffin was about to find out, parked at the dusty curb, his eyes locked on her homemade sign. The small, still figure by the roadside was a splash of color against the gray curb. A retired Marine Master Sergeant, Griff eased his foot off the accelerator, letting the low grumble of his modified Jeep Wrangler settle into an idle. The convoy of his brother's other veterans in trucks and jeeps rumbled past, but Griff slowed to a crawl. His trained eyes locked on the cardboard sign she clutched in two small, white-knuckled hands. The words, scrawled in wobbling marker, forced the air from his lungs. Rex. Good dog. $50. But it wasn't the sign that truly stopped him. It was her eyes. They were old, shadowed with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He pulled his Jeep over, the engine dying with a soft shudder. The sudden silence was heavy. He pushed the door open and stepped out, his movements deliberate and calm. "You selling your dog, kid?" he asked, his voice rough from years of shouting over engine noise and gunfire, but softer than he'd used in years. The girl flinched, gripping the sign like a shield. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "His name's Rex. He's a good dog." Beside her, a sturdy German shepherd sat at perfect attention, his intelligent eyes fixed on his owner, his posture that of a loyal soldier. Griff's gaze, honed by 2 decades of assessing threats and allies, swept over the animal. This was no stray. His coat was clean, his bearing protective. This was a family member. He looked from the dog's loyal face to the girl's desperate one. "Why?" was all he could manage, the single word heavy with a dread he knew all too well. "Why would you sell a good dog?" The girl's lower lip trembled. She stared down at her worn-out sneakers. "For Mommy," she murmured, so quiet he almost missed it. She hasn't eaten in 2 days." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The familiar sounds of traffic faded into a dull hum. He thought he was just stopping to check on a lost kid. He looked at the dog, Rex, who was now watching him with an unnerving intensity. The animal's gaze was a silent plea. Then, in a move that shattered Griff's defenses, the German shepherd slowly lifted a paw and placed it gently on the man's scarred combat boot. The weight of it was gentle but firm, a silent, profound request. "Help us." Behind him, the echo of his friend's engines faded. He didn't care. In that instant, the disciplined quiet of his life meant nothing. The deafening silence of this child's courage was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He crouched down, his large frame folding to bring himself to her level. The morning sun warmed his shoulders, but a deeper chill had settled in his soul. "Tell me about your dog," he said, his voice low. "Sweetheart." The girl's eyes, a soft shade of hazel, glistened with unshed tears. "He's all I have left," she said, the words so fragile he felt his own breath catch. He looked from the dog's loyal face to the girl's desperate one. He knew, with the terrifying certainty of a direct order, that he couldn't just drive away. He didn't know it yet, but the dog was already transmitting a silent, urgent message. Mission parameters have changed. The objective is survival. The girl, whose name was Maya, led the way. Griff walked beside her, his heavy combat boots crunching on the cracked pavement, a stark contrast to the quiet neighborhood. The dog, whom Maya called Ranger, trotted ahead, his tail held high, but his ears constantly swiveling, scanning for threats. He moved with the disciplined alertness of a trained sentry. The farther they went, the more the street seemed to decay. Paint peeled from house sidings like sunburnt skin, and lawns were choked with weeds. The air tasted of dry dust and decay, a sharp tang of rust from a discarded tricycle. Griff's worn canvas jacket, a relic from his service days, seemed too loud and out of place in this landscape of quiet surrender. He glanced down at Maya. She was so small, clutching Ranger's leash in one hand and the crumpled cardboard sign in the other. The silence between them was heavy, filled with things a child shouldn't have to say. He had to break it.
At Bonds Unspoken, we believe every story between a human and their animal companion deserves to be heard. If you agree, please like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you can join us every time another bond speaks louder than words.
"What's your name, kid?" he asked, his voice still rough but careful, the tone he'd used to calm a frightened local in a conflict zone. "Maya," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Maya Walsh." "Maya," he repeated. "That's a strong name." He paused, choosing his next words with the precision of a field operation. "How long have you been out there today? Trying to sell Ranger?" She thought for a moment, her small brow furrowing. "Since the sun came up," she whispered. "I went to the big store first, but a man told me to leave. He said I was scaring away customers." Her lip trembled. "One lady said she felt sorry for me, but that dogs cost too much to feed." Griff's knuckles whitened on the strap of his duffel bag. He'd faced enemy combatants, but this simple, brutal math of a child's survival threatened to breach defenses IEDs never could. He looked at Ranger, who glanced back at him as if understanding every word. The dog's eyes were full of a worried intelligence. For a fleeting second, Griff pictured the shepherd in the passenger seat of his Jeep, headed for a life of open roads and easy comforts. But the image dissolved as soon as it came. He looked at Maya, at the way her tiny hand rested on Ranger's back for reassurance, and he knew he could never be the man who severed that bond. He wasn't a hero. He was a man haunted by his own failures, by the men he couldn't bring home. Every good deed he'd ever tried to do felt like a dim echo of a life he'd lost long ago. But this felt different. This felt like a mission, a tangible objective in a world that had felt aimless since he'd taken off the uniform. "Tell you what, Maya," Griff finally said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "How about I walk you home first? I'd like to meet your mom." Maya stopped and looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Really?" "Yeah," Griff said, his gaze sweeping their surroundings, automatically noting exits and potential threats. "Something tells me this mission isn't over yet." Ranger let out a single, sharp bark, as if voicing his approval. The three of them, the broad-shouldered veteran, the tiny girl, and the loyal dog, continued down the broken path, a mismatched trio moving toward a truth that Griff sensed would be far uglier than he could imagine. The sun beat down on his shoulders, but a cold dread was beginning to pool in his stomach. What kind of situation had he just stepped into? The room held its breath after Griff spoke. The only sound was the weak, irregular click of the broken ceiling fan as it struggled to complete a rotation. Maya sat close to her mother, carefully tucking the thin blanket around her thin shoulders. Maya's small, shaking hands, as she tucked the blanket around her mother, were a perfect mirror of his daughter's. The ghost of a laugh he hadn't heard in a decade echoed in the silent room, and he had to turn away, his own hands trembling. Ranger remained at his post, his head on the woman's lap, his soulful eyes watching Griff, seeming to measure the man's intent. Griff stayed standing, his large frame making the small room feel even smaller. He kept his hands loose at his sides, a conscious effort to appear less intimidating. The woman's confession hung in the air between them, a husband who left, a life stripped away. "Ma'am," Griff began again, his voice low and careful, the tone he'd used to debrief a nervous informant. "This been what happened after he left? Did he ever try to contact you?" The woman, who had introduced herself as Sarah, hesitated. Her gaze drifted to a water stain on the far wall, as if it were a map of her ruined life. "His name is Ben," she said, the correction soft, as if out of habit. "Ben Walsh. He used to work at the lumber yard. He was a good man, a good father." Her eyes glistened, remembering a ghost. "Then the mill closed. Just like that, hundreds of jobs gone." She drew a shaky breath. He tried. He really did. Drove to the next city, filled out applications. But weeks turned into months. The bills piled up. The laughter in this house just disappeared. She looked at Maya, forcing a small, broken smile for her daughter. "He started drinking. Said he couldn't look at us without feeling like a failure. I begged him to get help, but one night he just packed a bag and left." Griff's jaw tightened. He could picture the type. The weight of responsibility becoming too heavy, until the only solution was to run from it. He'd seen it in young soldiers who couldn't handle the pressure, though they'd usually had the chain of command to catch them. "He didn't leave you anything?" Griff asked, though he already knew the answer. He could see it in the empty shelves, feel it in the stagnant air. Sarah shook her head, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "He took everything," she whispered, the words laced with a fresh, quiet agony. "The savings, the car, even—" Her voice broke completely. "Even my wedding ring. He said he needed to start over, that we were holding him back." Maya's small face crumpled. She clutched her mother's hand. "Mommy told me he was coming back," the little girl said, her voice small and hollow. "But I heard him before he left. He said we should sell whatever was left." Her bottom lip trembled. "That's why I thought maybe I should sell Ranger." The words were a physical blow to Griff's chest. He crouched down, his knees popping, bringing himself to Maya's eye level. "Hey, look at me, kid," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You did nothing wrong. You hear me? Nothing at all." Maya nodded weakly, but the tears kept coming. Ranger whined softly and licked her hand, his tail giving a single, comforting thump against the floorboards. As he stood back up, a cold, familiar anger began to simmer in Griff's gut. He had met men like Ben Walsh before, men who saw family as a chain and responsibility as a prison. It wasn't just the cruelty that infuriated him. It was the sheer, pathetic cowardice of it all. "Does he know?" Griff asked, his voice dropping, becoming deceptively calm. "Does Ben have any idea how you're living now?" Sarah shook her head, wiping her cheek with a trembling hand. "He doesn't care. The last I heard from a neighbor, he'd joined up with some private security crew out near the desert. A rough group, I think." That caught Griff's attention. His eyes narrowed slightly, his focus sharpening. The pieces were starting to click into a much darker picture. "You know the name of that crew?" he asked, every muscle in his body going still. Sarah hesitated, searching her memory. "It was something like the Ravens." Griff froze. The name the Ravens hit him with the force of a suppressed memory. They weren't just any PMC. They were the same disreputable outfit that had been operating on the fringes during his last tour, known for abandoning contracts and leaving local allies to die. They were poison, and now one of their own had left his child to starve. He looked from Sarah's exhausted face to Maya's tear-streaked one, and then to Ranger, the loyal guardian caught in the middle. His fists clenched, not with blind rage, but with a cold, solid resolve. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm and clear, cutting through the despair in the room. "You and your girl are not alone anymore. Not as long as I'm breathing." For the first time that day, a real, fragile flicker of hope illuminated Sarah's eyes. It was a small light in the overwhelming darkness, but it was there. It was a start. When Griff stepped back outside, the weight of the truth felt like a physical burden on his shoulders. The door creaked shut behind him, muffling the sound of Maya's soft voice as she talked to Ranger. He leaned against the cool metal of his Jeep, pulling a cigarette from his jacket pocket. He didn't even light it. He just rolled it between his fingers, a nervous habit. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, lonely jingle of Ranger's tags from inside the house. The sound was a tiny bell, tolling for a life of hardship he could scarcely comprehend. He'd met plenty of people down on their luck. He'd given spare cash, bought meals, even fixed a few cars. But this was different. That little girl, Maya, her eyes held something that went beyond sadness. It was a profound loss, a hollowed-out look he saw in his own reflection every single morning. It was the look of someone who had loved deeply and had that love torn away. He let out a shaky breath, his eyes burning. That title, father, had died with her memory in his heart. The guilt had never faded. It just changed shape, hardening into a core of anger he carried everywhere. He tried to drown it in work and the camaraderie of his brothers in arms, but all it did was turn him into a ghost, a man who kept moving so he wouldn't have to stand still and feel. Now, standing in this broken place, watching another little girl trying to be brave for her mother, he felt the past and present collide with terrifying force. Maya's small, shaking hands reminded him of Chloe's. The way she clung to a sliver of hope, even when the world had given her nothing, was like seeing his daughter alive again in a life she was never allowed to live. Griff finally lit the cigarette, taking a long, slow drag. The smoke burned his lungs, a familiar punishment. He stared at the peeling paint on the house, at the overgrown weeds, at the symbol of a family abandoned. He had spent years running from his failure. He had built a new identity on being strong, untouchable. But you can't outrun a ghost. And sometimes, a ghost leads you to where you need to be. He dropped the cigarette, crushing the ember under the heavy heel of his boot. His jaw set into a hard, determined line. "No more running," he muttered to the silent street. He turned back toward the door, his eyes clear and sharp, not with guilt this time, but with a purpose he hadn't felt since his last command. He didn't know how yet, but he had made a silent, unbreakable vow. He would make things right for Maya and Sarah. Because maybe, just maybe, saving them was the only way to finally save what was left of his own soul. But how could he have known that this act of mercy would drag a ghost from his own past into the light? The sun had bled away, leaving a bruised purple and orange sky in its wake by the time Griff returned to the Vanguard's HQ. It was a repurposed warehouse on the industrial edge of town, a sanctuary that smelled of sawdust, engine oil, and strong coffee. Inside, the usual atmosphere of focused work reigned. But when Griff walked through the heavy roll-up door, the energy in the room shifted. The warehouse fell silent. The buzz of a table saw dying mid-cut. All eyes tracked Griff as he walked to the central workbench and placed his keys down with a definitive clack. "I met a little girl today," he began, his voice cutting through the silence. "Name's Maya." A few of the guys exchanged confused glances. A couple chuckled nervously, expecting a punchline. Griff's stories usually started with a tough mission or a close call, not a little girl. "She was standing on the side of the road," he continued, his tone flat and factual, which made it all the more powerful, "with a cardboard sign. She was trying to sell her dog." This time, the chuckles were a little louder, more uneasy. They thought it was a scam, a con. Then they saw Griff's eyes. They were cold, wet, and utterly real. "She wasn't hustling," Griff said, his voice dropping lower, gaining an edge that could cut steel. "She was hungry. Her mom, she hasn't eaten in 2 days." The last traces of laughter vanished. The air in the workshop grew thick and heavy. These were hard men, but they lived by a code. You didn't abandon your own, and you protected those who couldn't protect themselves. It was a principle that transcended the battlefield. "And the bastard who left them like that," Griff paused, letting the tension build, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his brothers. "He used to run with the Ravens." The reaction was instant and visceral. It was like he tossed a live grenade into the room. The name the Ravens was a curse here. It meant the ambush on a joint patrol outside a dusty village, where the Ravens broke contract and pulled out, leaving their flank exposed. It meant Davis's shattered leg and the months of physical therapy. It meant a deep, festering contempt for mercenaries without honor. Davis stood up straight, his playful demeanor gone, replaced by a cold fire. "You're telling me one of them left his own kid to starve?" he asked, his voice tight. Griff gave a single, slow nod. "Yeah, and we're not looking the other way on this one. Not this time." A heavy silence followed, the kind that presses on your eardrums. Then Mac, the oldest member of the group with a face like a road map of bad deployments and arms covered in faded unit tattoos, stepped forward. He was the voice of reason, the calm in the storm. "What's the play, Griff?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "What are our orders?" Griff exhaled, his broad shoulders squaring. "We fix it," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each of his brothers. "This isn't about payback. Not yet. This is about a humanitarian mission. That girl and her mother have nothing. No food, no hope, no one. So we're going to be that someone." The room erupted, but not with disagreement. It was a chorus of grim assent. "Roger that, I'm in," one vet growled, slamming his fist on the workbench. "About time we used these hands for something other than building furniture," another added. "It settled then," Griff said, a faint, hard smile touching his lips for the first time since he'd returned. "First light tomorrow, we move out. Groceries, supplies, whatever they need. We're going to make that house feel like a home again." Davis grinned, a fierce, eager light in his eyes. "And what about the dad? This Ben Walsh guy?" Griff's eyes darkened, the smile vanishing. "We'll deal with him when the time is right. But right now, the priority is the family he left behind." The group nodded in silent, unified agreement. The atmosphere in the workshop had transformed. The restless energy that usually fueled their projects had been channeled, focused into a single, tangible objective. The laughter was gone, but in its place was something stronger, something unbreakable. As the night wore on and plans were made, lists scribbled on with scraps, phone calls to a 24-hour grocery. Griff sat alone on an upturned crate. He stared at the moonlight glinting off a piece of polished steel, but he wasn't seeing the reflection. He was seeing Maya's trembling hands, hearing her voice, so small and yet so brave. "Mommy hasn't eaten in 2 days." The words played on a loop in his mind, a mantra of failure and a call to action. For years, he had led these men through missions, through rebuilding their lives, through the daily battle of civilian transition. He had built a reputation on being the toughest, the most unshakable. But now, for the first time, he was leading them into something that truly mattered on a human level. He was leading them toward hope. He stood a little straighter, the weight of their trust squaring his shoulders, anchoring him to the ground for the first time in years. The first sliver of dawn was painting the sky a pale gray when the vanguard assembled. This wasn't a mission for show or for speed. It was a logistics run. Their trucks and jeeps weren't filled with tools for a project, but with boxes of food, bags of groceries, bundles of new blankets, and toolboxes filled with intent. Griff led the pack, the wind whipping through his open window. The determination was etched into every line of his face, a mask of focused will. Behind him, the rest of the crew followed, a procession of rough souls on a quiet mission. They didn't look like the heroes from storybooks. They looked like what they were, men who had seen too much of the world's darkness, now driving directly into a small pocket of it, armed not with weapons, but with a desperate, fragile kind of hope. The morning erupted into a symphony of purposeful noise. The low grumble of the truck engines was replaced by the sound of heavy boots on creaking floorboards, the rip of tape from cardboard boxes, and the low, steady murmur of men working with practiced efficiency. The small, dilapidated house, which had known only silence and despair for so long, was suddenly alive. Davis and another vet named Jax started with the groceries, carrying in boxes filled with canned goods, fresh bread, fruit, and meats. Their heavily tattooed arms, usually seen gripping tools or steadying lumber, were now carefully stacking supplies on the barren kitchen counters. Mac, with his practical, no-nonsense efficiency, immediately set to work on a small, portable generator he brought, its steady hum soon replacing the eerie silence of the dead appliances. Sarah Walsh stood by the doorway to the living room, her hand still over her mouth, tears now streaming freely down her face. She wasn't sad, she was overwhelmed. It was the shock of seeing kindness in its most raw and unexpected form. These rugged, capable strangers were moving through her broken home with a gentle, focused determination she hadn't seen in years. Maya watched everything with wide, awestruck eyes, following Ranger as he trotted from room to room, sniffing every box and pair of boots as if conducting his own inspection. The dog's tail never stopped wagging. At one point, Maya tugged gently on Griff's sleeve. He was directing 2 men carrying a new mattress into the back bedroom. He looked down at her. "Sir," she said shyly, "Mommy says people don't do things like this for free." Griff knelt down, the fabric of his cargo pants rustling. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile that softened the hard lines of his face. "Then your mommy hasn't met the right kind of people yet, Maya." Her resulting giggle was a bright, clear sound that cut through the grim atmosphere, brighter than the new light bulbs they were installing. It was the sound of a child remembering what joy felt like. The work continued through the morning. Rick, one of the older vets, was up on the sagging porch roof, his powerful frame hammering new shingles over the leaks with brisk, efficient strokes. The rhythmic bang, bang, bang was like a heartbeat, pumping new life into the structure. Inside, another man was on his knees, carefully scrubbing years of grime from the floorboards, while Davis patched a large crack in the living room wall with fresh drywall compound. The smell of the house began to change. The stale scent of dust and decay was slowly being overpowered by the sharp, clean odor of fresh paint, the richness of wood polish, and the inviting aroma of soup heating on the new hot plate connected to the generator. As Davis smoothed the plaster over the crack, his trowel hit something solid behind the damaged drywall. "Hey, Griff," he called out, his voice curious. "You might want to take a look at this." Davis carefully dug around the obstruction with his fingers, pulling away splintered pieces of wallboard. He reached in and retrieved a small, rectangular object. It was a picture frame. He wiped the grime away with his sleeve and froze. "Griff," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You need to see this." Griff walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "What is it?" Davis handed him the frame. Griff took it from Davis's suddenly still hands. His own breath caught in his throat. Inside was a photograph, its colors faded with time, but its image painfully clear. It was a family portrait. A younger, healthier Sarah stood beside a man with a confident, easy smile, his arm wrapped around her. Perched on the man's shoulders was a beaming, toddler-aged Maya. They were all smiling, bathed in golden sunlight, a picture of perfect, uncomplicated happiness. But what turned Griff's blood to ice wasn't the joy in the image. It was the man. Mac walked in behind him, his eyes narrowing at the photograph. "You gotta be kidding me," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Griff shook his head slowly, his grip tightening on the frame. "No joke," he said, his voice a dark, low rumble. "That's Ben Walsh. I remember him. He was with the Ravens support element during that joint op near the Syrian border. He was there the night they abandoned their post and let our supply convoy walk into an ambush." The room fell into a deep, heavy silence. Every man present knew that story. The ambush was a foundational scar for their unit. They had lost vital supplies and, most importantly, their trust in allied contractors. It was a betrayal that had fueled years of bitterness. And now, the man at the center of this family's collapse was the same man who had helped stab them in the back years ago. The personal and the historical had collided in this dusty, forgotten photograph. Griff's jaw clenched, the muscles ticking under his skin. He stared at the face of Ben Walsh, at the easy smile of a man who had once had everything and had thrown it all away. He had abandoned his family to poverty and starvation, and he had betrayed his brothers in arms. "So that's the man who took everything from them," Griff said quietly, the words dripping with a cold, controlled fury. Jax frowned, his boyish face hardening. "And he's still out there, probably living easy while they were eating crackers from a cabinet. What are our orders, Sarge?" Griff's gaze shifted from the photograph to the cracked window. Outside, Maya was now sitting on the repaired porch steps, carefully feeding Ranger a piece of sliced apple from the new groceries. Her small face was lit with a simple, pure happiness. His voice dropped to a near whisper, cold and sharp as a combat knife. "We find him. Because now this isn't just about a humanitarian mission anymore. It's about accountability. And he's got a debt to pay." The photograph changed everything. The satisfied atmosphere of a mission accomplished evaporated, replaced by a cold, focused energy. The kindness hadn't vanished, but it was now armored in resolve. The vanguard finished their work on the Walsh house with a new, grim efficiency. The repaired home was no longer just a project. It was the forward operating base for a new operation. Later that evening, back at the warehouse, the mood was starkly different from the night before. There was no casual banter, no sounds of construction. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and quiet intent. Maps were spread across the workbench, held down by coffee mugs and socket sets. Griff stood at the head, the discovered photograph lying face up like a piece of intelligence. "Ben Walsh," Griff said, tapping the image of the smiling man. "Last known affiliation, the Ravens support element. The trail went cold after the border ambush. We need to heat up. The intelligence network of a close-knit veteran community, built on a web of contacts, VA connections, and shared history, was activated. Phone calls were made in low tones. Messages were sent through secure channels. These men knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. It was a skill born from tracking high-value targets and locating missing personnel, now being repurposed. Within hours, the information trickled in. The pieces came together with unnerving speed. A washed-up drifter matching Ben's description, still known to boast about his time with the Ravens, had been seen drowning his sorrows at a roadside dive called the Rusty Nail, a known hangout for transients and outlaws on the edge of the next county. It was the kind of place that existed in the spaces between towns, where the law was a suggestion and the beer was always warm. The Rusty Nail, Matt confirmed, hanging up his phone. Bartender says he's a regular. Sits in the same corner booth. Drinks the same cheap whiskey until his money runs out. Sounds like a real stand-up guy. Griff's expression was unreadable. Then we pay him a visit. The drive to the Rusty Nail was nothing like the hopeful morning convoy. This was a night operation, shrouded in darkness and purpose. The rumble of their engines was a deliberate announcement. They weren't bringing supplies. They were bringing a reckoning. Griff's grip on the steering wheel was so tight the leather creaked. He took a slow, deliberate breath, focusing his intent. Intel gathering, not an assault. The wind whipped against the jeeps, but it didn't feel freeing. It felt like a resistance they had to push through. Griff led the way, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The image of Maya's hopeful face warred with the memory of Ben's smug smile in the photograph. He thought of Sarah's hollow cheeks and Davis's permanent limp. After an hour, the lonely glow of a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance, a crooked nail dripping rust-colored light. The Rusty Nail. It was as bleak as advertised, a low-slung building of cinder block and despair, surrounded by gravel and a handful of beat-up trucks. Griff parked his Jeep directly in front of the entrance, the headlight cutting a beam through the smoky window. The rest of the crew fanned out, killing their engines, but remaining in their vehicles, a silent, imposing perimeter. This was Griff's show. "You sure about this, Sarge?" Davis asked, his voice tight. "Walking in there alone?" "I'm not going in for a fight," Griff said, his voice low. "I just want to talk." The moment he pushed through the scarred wooden door, the bar's atmosphere hit him like a wall, a thick brew of stale beer, old smoke, and the sour tang of hopelessness. A country song about lost wine from a cracked jukebox. A handful of patrons, their faces etched with hard miles, looked up from their drinks, their eyes cautious and assessing. And there he was. Just as described, in a corner booth, half hidden in shadow, sat Ben Walsh. He was a ghost of the man in the photograph. His shoulders were slumped, his beard was long and unkempt, and he cradled a glass of amber liquid, as if it were the only thing tethering him to the world. He looked up as Griff approached, his movements slow, his eyes bleary and unfocused. It took a moment for recognition to dawn. Ben squinted, his brow furrowing. "Griff?" His voice was a dry rasp, cracked with surprise and something else, fear. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't expect to see your face in a place like this." Griff pulled out the opposite chair, the metal legs scraping harshly against the concrete floor. He sat down, his large frame dominating the small space. "Long time no see, Ben." Ben offered a weak, nervous smile. "What brings the great Master Sergeant Griffin out to the middle of nowhere?" "Looking to recruit." He tried to sound casual, but the tremor in his hand was unmistakable. Griff didn't smile back. He leaned forward, his elbows on the sticky table, his voice dropping to a low, cold frequency that carried no further than their booth. "You left behind more than just your unit years ago, Ben." The forced humor vanished from Ben's face. He frowned, a genuine confusion clouding his features. "What are you talking about?" Griff's eyes hardened. "A little girl named Maya. A woman named Sarah. Ring any bells?" The color drained from Ben's face so completely he looked like a corpse. The glass shook in his hand, sloshing whiskey onto the table. "You," he stammered, his eyes wide with panic. "You found them." "I didn't find them," Griff snapped, the control in his voice beginning to fracture. Your daughter was standing on the side of the road, in the dust and the heat, trying to sell her goddamn dog, because her mother hadn't eaten in 2 days. The bar around them seemed to freeze. The bartender stopped polishing a glass. A pool game in the corner halted. Every ear was tuned to the quiet, terrifying anger in the large veteran's voice. Ben flinched as if he'd been struck. I didn't mean for it to get that bad," he whispered, his words tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. Things fell apart. I couldn't." Griff slammed his open hand on the table. The impact was like a gunshot, making Ben jump and the entire bar flinch. "You took everything, Ben." Griff's voice dropped to a deadly calm, each word measured and cold. "You left your little girl to beg strangers for food." Tears welled in Ben's eyes, but they inspired no pity in Griff. They were tears of self-pity, not remorse. The man was crumbling before him, but all Griff could see was Maya's tear-streaked face. "I was ashamed." Ben choked out, sobbing now, his head in his hands. "I couldn't face them. I thought they were better off without me." Griff stood up, the chair screeching behind him. He looked down at the weeping man, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "They weren't," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "But they survived. Because your daughter was braver at 8 years old than you've been your entire life." He tossed a few bills onto the table, more than enough to cover the ruined drink. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at the broken figure in the booth. "You want to fix what you broke," Griff said, his final words hanging in the stale air. "Then start by being a man again. But don't you dare come near them until you're ready to face the truth of what you are." Without another word, he walked out, leaving the sound of Ben Walsh's sobs behind him. As the door swung shut, he heard the bar remain silent, the weight of his judgment filling the space. Outside, the cool night air was a relief. His crew looked at him, questions in their eyes. Griff climbed into his jeep, his heart pounding, not with rage, but with a grim, sorrowful finality. Tonight hadn't been about vengeance. It had been about bearing witness. It had been about forcing a man to look into the mirror of his own failures. As the engines roared back to life, Griff knew the confrontation was over, but the echoes of it would linger forever. The ride back from the Rusty Nail was a silent, somber procession. The wind that whipped past the jeeps felt different now, colder, heavier, carrying the ghost of Ben Walsh's broken sobs. There was no victory in the air, no satisfying thrum of payback. Just the dull, steady roar of engines and the weight of a truth that was uglier than any of them had imagined. Griff led the way, his mind replaying the confrontation in a relentless loop. He had seen men break before. He'd seen enemy combatants crumple, informants beg for extraction, and tough recruits crack under pressure. But what he witnessed in that bar was a different kind of breaking. It wasn't from an external force. It was an internal collapse. Ben wasn't just afraid of Griff. He was being devoured by his own shame. It was a hollow, pathetic end for the man in the sunny photograph. When they finally pulled over at a deserted lookout point on the edge of town, the silence continued as they killed their engines. The sprawling city lights glittered in the distance below, a world of normalcy that felt a million miles away. The only sounds were the soft tink of cooling metal and the lonely chirp of crickets in the tall grass. Mac was the first to break the quiet, his voice a low rumble in the dark. "So what's the sitrap, Sergeant?" he asked, leaning against his jeep. "You gonna make him pay? For what he did to his family? For the ambush?" Griff exhaled, a long, slow breath that misted in the chill night air. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the hard planes of his face for a moment. "That man's been paying every single day since he walked out on them," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You saw him. He's not living. He's just existing. He's a ghost in his own life." Jax kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering into the darkness. "Still doesn't feel right," he muttered, his young face etched with a desire for a cleaner, more brutal justice. That little girl was eating crackers from a cabinet while he was drowning in cheap whiskey. He deserves to hurt. Griff nodded slowly, taking a drag from his cigarette. The ember glowed like a single angry eye. Yeah, I know. It doesn't feel right. But what's more punishment going to do? Hurt him more? Hitting him now is like kicking a rotten stump. There's nothing solid left to break, Mac. His question hung in the cool air, challenging them, challenging himself. For years, his entire code had been built on a foundation of completing the mission and holding the line. But staring into the abyss of Ben's regret, he saw the futility of adding more violence to the equation. Davis, the quiet vet with a talent for mechanics, crossed his arms. You're really just going to let him go? After everything? Griff glanced toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn was a pale smear of light. No, he said softly, the word carrying a strange finality. I'm not letting him go. I'm letting him remember. The others watched him, their expressions a mixture of uncertainty and trust. They had followed Griff through firefights, through IED blasts, through the chaos of withdrawal. But this act of mercy, this refusal to strike the final blow, felt somehow harder, more demanding than any combat mission. He'll live every day knowing his daughter tried to sell her best friend, her only protector, just to buy a loaf of bread, Griff continued, his voice dropping, becoming almost introspective. He'll see Maya's face in every shadow, hear her voice in every quiet moment. That's a burden no man can ever outrun. That's his prison, and the walls are built from his own choices. Vengeance was a clean, simple path. This mercy felt infinitely more difficult. Griff made his choice. He dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot, grinding the ember into nothing. The action was decisive. The discussion was over. He had made his choice, and it was not the choice of the man who solely defined himself by the chain of command. Now, he said, his voice regaining its familiar command, but now layered with a new, profound certainty. Let's go home. We've got a family waiting on us. As they mounted up, the mood had shifted once more. The anger had dissipated, replaced by a weary, sober resolve. They weren't riding away from a defeated enemy. They were choosing to walk a different path. As the engines roared to life, the sound was no longer a threat, but a declaration, a promise to be better, to build rather than break. The sun began to rise as they drove, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, washing the world in a new, clean light. Griff led his crew not toward vengeance, but toward the small, repaired house on Willow Lane. He was choosing compassion over retribution, and in doing so he was finally, truly, redeeming not just Ben's family, but his own soul. The road stretched out before them, leading them out of the darkness of the night and into the promise of the dawn. For the first time in a long time, the path ahead felt straight and true. 2 days later, the morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of recent rain. Griff drove alone back to Willow Lane, the growl of his Jeep a solitary sound against the quiet hum of the waking neighborhood. He wasn't leading a convoy this time. This visit was personal. As he turned onto the street, he saw that the house already looked different. The new paint gleamed softly in the morning light, and the repaired porch stood straight and proud. Maya was sitting on the top step, her small form hunched over in concentration. As he got closer, he saw she was carefully braiding a piece of faded blue ribbon into Ranger's collar. The German shepherd sat patiently, thumping his tail against the wood the moment he recognized the familiar rumble of Griff's Jeep. When Maya looked up and saw him, her face erupted into a sunrise of a smile. "Mr. Griff," she shouted, scrambling to her feet and running toward the gate, Ranger bounding joyfully at her side. Griff cut the engine and stepped out, the vehicle settling into a comfortable silence. He smiled down at her. "Hey, kid, I see you're putting my favorite soldier through a uniform inspection." She giggled, the sound like wind chimes. "He's your favorite?" "Really, the best one I've ever served with," Griff said, his voice warm and genuine. He crouched down, and Ranger immediately pressed his snout into the veteran's hand, letting out a soft, happy whine that vibrated through Griff's palm. The dog's trust was a tangible thing, a gift he didn't take lightly. Maya's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a curious, hesitant look. She fiddled with the end of the ribbon. "Mr. Griff?" she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Did you find my daddy?" The question hung in the air. Griff paused, his hand stilling on Ranger's head. He met her gaze, his expression softening with a gravity that was meant for her, but that a child could only partially understand. "Yeah, Maya," he said carefully. "I found him." Her eyes widened, full of a hope that was painful to see. "Is he coming home?" Griff chose his words with the care of a man defusing an explosive. "He's got a lot to think about, sweetheart. A lot to make up for. But he knows what he did was wrong." He saw the confusion in her eyes and added, "Your mommy's right. Sometimes people get lost. But that doesn't mean they can't find their way back." Maya nodded slowly, absorbing this. The simple, profound wisdom of a child who had to grow up too fast. "Mommy says sometimes the way back is the hardest road." "Your mom," Griff said, his voice thick with emotion, "is a very smart woman." He then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small brown envelope, slightly crumpled from the drive. "Got something for you," he said, offering it to her. Maya blinked in surprise. "For me?" "Go on," he encouraged. "Open it." Her small, careful fingers tore the edge of the envelope. Inside, she found a stack of bills, folded neatly and securely around a prepaid grocery card. But it was the small, silver object that fell into her palm that made her gasp. It was a dog tag, beautifully engraved, catching the morning sun. She held it up, her eyes tracing the words, "Ranger. Forever home." Her small hands began to shake. Tears welled up instantly, spilling over and tracing clean paths down her cheeks. You made him a real tag," she breathed, her voice trembling with awe. Griff's smile was soft, reaching his eyes. "Yeah. Now nobody's ever taking him away from you again. That's a promise." The words broke the dam. She threw her arms around his neck, her small face pressing into the rough canvas of his jacket. He felt the fragile weight of her trust settle deep within him, a warmth he thought had been extinguished forever. "Thank you, Mr. Griff," she whispered. "Thank you. Mommy's going to cry when she sees this." Griff hugged her back gently, one large hand cradling her head. He closed his eyes, blinking hard against the sudden, sharp sting of his own tears. "You two deserve some good days, Maya," he murmured into her hair, the words of vow. "Plenty more coming." As he stepped back and rose to his feet, Ranger barked happily, running in tight, excited circles around them, as if he understood the significance of the shiny new token. The dog's joy was pure, uncomplicated, a perfect mirror of the hope now shining in Maya's eyes. From the doorway, Sarah watched the scene, one hand pressed to her heart. She didn't try to hide her tears. They were tears of relief, of a burden being lifted. She offered Griff a watery, grateful smile, and he gave her a single firm nod. No more words were needed. As Griff turned back toward his jeep, Maya stood on the porch, waving wildly with one hand, the other clutching the silver tag to her chest, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. And for the first time since he could remember, standing there in the quiet morning, Jax Griffin felt something settle deep within his soul. It was a feeling he had long forgotten, a quiet hum that had nothing to do with engines and everything to do with peace. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was a beautiful place to stop and rest. Weeks unfurled like a smooth, open road. The little house at the end of Willow Lane was no longer a place of sorrow. It had been reborn, its very foundation seeming to hum with a new, vibrant energy. Fresh, white paint gleamed against the blue sky, and clusters of golden marigolds and purple petunias now bloomed in a small garden by the porch, a defiant splash of color against the memory of weeds. The sound that defined the house was no longer the creak of a broken step or the sigh of despair, but the clear, ringing laughter of a little girl that echoed through every room, bouncing off the freshly scrubbed walls. The Vanguard had become a regular, welcome fixture. Every Saturday morning, without fail, Maya would perch on the porch steps, a sentinel of anticipation. The moment the first distant rumble of their jeeps touched the air, she would leap to her feet, a wide grin splitting her face. They're here, Ranger." The dog would burst into a frenzy of happy barks, sprinting down the repaired walkway, his tail a blur of motion, as the small convoy rolled into view. The neighbors, who once peeked through curtains with suspicion, now waved from their yards or offered casual nods. The sound of the engines was no longer a warning. It was the sound of community. "Hey there, troublemaker," Griff would call out, his voice booming with affection as he killed his engine. Ranger would leap up, planting his front paws on Griff's chest, tail whipping back and forth as the veteran scratched behind his ears. "You keeping the perimeter secure?" Ranger would bark once, a proud affirmative sound, before spinning around and racing back to Maya's side. She would giggle, her fingers instinctively finding the silver "Forever Home" tag that hung from his collar, a talisman she never removed. Inside, the transformation of Sarah was just as profound. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out, and color had returned to her skin. She had found a job as a waitress at a local diner, and for the first time in years, she smiled without a trace of hidden exhaustion. The house was filled with the smells of simple, good food cooking on the stove, and the dusty old radio in the kitchen now played soft music, its melodies weaving through the sounds of conversation and laughter. One balmy evening, Griff sat on the porch, a cool bottle of water in his hand, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and gold. In the front yard, Maya was playing with Ranger, tossing a ragged tennis ball and spinning with joy as he chased it. Mac and Davis were a few feet away, ostensibly fixing a squeaky gate, but their movements had slowed to a stop as they watched the scene. Mac chuckled softly, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, more to himself than to Davis. "See what?" Davis asked, tightening a bolt. "The Sarge," Mac said, nodding toward Griff. "Smiling like that. I mean really smiling. Not the brief one he'd flash after a successful op." Davis looked over and grunted in agreement. "Guess even the toughest soldiers have a heart hiding under all that camo." Griff pretended not to hear them. He just watched Maya and her mother, who was now sitting on the steps, her face relaxed and peaceful. He felt something inside him, a deep, old crack that had been part of him for so long, finally begin to knit itself back together. This wasn't about atonement anymore. It was about something simpler and far more powerful: purpose. It was about finding meaning not in conflict, but in connection, in the act of giving without any expectation of return. Ranger trotted up to the porch and sat down heavily beside Griff's boot, his tongue lolling out in a happy pant. He leaned his warm, solid weight against the man's leg. Griff reached out and scratched the spot between the dog's ears that made his back leg thump. "You held the line, buddy," he said, his voice low and rough with affection. "You held the line. Good man." As the group prepared to leave later that night, the scene was one of quiet contentment. The men headed to their vehicles with easy familiarity, their goodbyes to Sarah and Maya filled with warm respect. Ranger's silhouette, strong and proud, trotted alongside the idling jeeps for a few feet before stopping at the edge of the property line, his watch duty complete for the day. Under the glow of the rising moon, his dark fur edged in silver, he looked like a mythic guardian. It was in that moment that the thought, which had been simmering in Griff's mind for weeks, finally crystallized. Sometimes, he thought, the angels don't have wings. They have 4 paws, a loyal heart, and a rescue that arrives in a dusty jeep. A few days later, back at the warehouse, the familiar scent of sawdust and oil was a comfort. The crew was working on a new project, the air filled with the sounds of casual conversation and the clatter of tools. Davis walked over to Griff, holding a small, white envelope. "This came for you, Sarge," he said, scratching his head with a greasy finger. "Kid's handwriting, I think." The envelope was a little crumpled, addressed in a child's careful, looping script that felt achingly familiar. Griff wiped his hands on a rag and took the envelope. He felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. He sat down on an upturned crate and carefully opened it. The letter inside was written in bright purple ink, each letter pressed hard into the paper as if the writer had poured all her strength into it. At the top was a crayon drawing of a jeep with large, feathery wings. He smiled. He began to read, his eyes moving slowly over the words. "Dear Mr. Griff and the Jeep Soldiers, Mommy says thank you isn't enough, but I'll say it anyway. Thank you for fixing our house and bringing food and new lights. Mommy has a new job at the diner now. Ranger waits for her every night by the door until she comes home. We planted flowers in the front yard. Mommy says they're for the people who gave us hope. I named the biggest one Jack Sunflower because it's strong and tall like you. I'm saving up the money you gave us to buy Ranger a red ball and maybe some treats. He still sleeps by my bed, and when I hear Jeeps, he runs to the window. I think he misses you, too. Love. Maya and Ranger. By the time he finished reading, Griff's vision had blurred. He cleared his throat roughly, pretending to brush a speck of dust from his eye. The other men, sensing the moment, had fallen silent, but they tactfully looked away, giving him the privacy he needed. He carefully folded the letter, the paper crisp and sincere in his hands, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket, right over his heart. It felt like armor. Mac was the one who finally broke the silence, his voice uncharacteristically soft. She called us Jeep soldiers, huh? Griff let out a choked chuckle. Guess we've been called worse, he managed, his voice thick with emotion. He stood up, the crate scraping against the concrete floor. The decision was immediate and sure. We'll drive by this weekend, he announced, his voice regaining its steady command. Got a sunflower to see. As the engines roared to life, the men shared grins. The sound was the same, but the feeling was entirely new. Somewhere out there, a little girl believed in them. And for a group of men who had spent their lives following orders and facing the worst of humanity, that belief, that pure, unshakable faith, was a force more powerful than any enemy they'd ever faced. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows when the vanguard made their drive to Willow Lane one last time. The air was still and warm, the sky a breathtaking canvas of orange and crimson as the sun began its descent. The familiar, thunderous hum of their engines was a gentle roll this time, a respectful announcement of their arrival. They weren't coming to fix anything. There was nothing left to fix. They were coming to say goodbye. Not a permanent one, but the kind that acknowledges a mission is complete, a chapter is closed. Maya was waiting for them on the porch, just as she always did. Ranger sat beside her, regal and calm, his tail swishing slowly across the clean wooden planks in a steady, welcoming rhythm. When the Jeeps came to a stop, she didn't run forward shouting. Instead, she walked slowly down the path, a look of serene happiness on her face, a folded piece of paper held carefully in her hands. "You came back," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. Griff stepped out of his Jeep. His face, once a mask of hardened lines, was soft in the evening light. "Told you we would, kid. A good soldier never leaves a man behind." She shyly offered him the paper. "I wrote something else. For you and your friends." Griff took it, his rough, calloused fingers feeling delicate against the crinkled notebook paper. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was still a child's, but the letters were a little more confident, a little less shaky. At the top, she had drawn a row of Jeeps, each with a tiny, smiling face. He read it silently first, the words hitting him with a profound, quiet force. Then he cleared his throat and read it aloud for his crew, his voice, usually a low rumble, now clear and steady, carrying Maya's message to every man. "Dear Mr. Griff, thank you for being my hero. You said angels don't wear wings, but I think they wear jackets that smell like sawdust and coffee. Love, Maya and Ranger." The men stood in a silent half-circle around him. The wind, which had been still, picked up gently, carrying Maya's simple, profound truth to each of them. It was a truth that rewrote their entire story, that redefined who they were. Even the toughest among them, men who had seen the darkest sides of life, blinked hard, quickly turning their faces or adjusting their sunglasses to hide the emotion they could no longer contain. Griff looked up from the note, his own eyes shining. He forced a grin, the kind that was real and full of heart. "You hear that, boys?" he called out, his voice thick but strong. "We've been promoted, from soldiers to angels." A wave of deep, honest laughter rippled through the crew. It was a sound of release, of pride, of a burden being transformed into a badge of honor. Mac, his own gruff exterior melted away, raised his coffee thermos high into the air. "To the kid," he shouted, his voice booming with emotion. "And to her mom." The others followed suit, lifting their mugs and water bottles, like chalices in the dying light. To Maya, to Sarah, they chorused, their voices united in a pledge of unwavering support. The golden sunset wrapped around them, a natural spotlight on this moment of pure, unvarnished grace. Griff turned to face Sarah and Maya, who stood together, arm in arm, both smiling through their own tears. "You too," he said, his voice dropping back to its familiar, steady tone, but now layered with a permanent warmth. "You ever need anything at all, you know where to find us." Maya nodded, her small hand resting on Ranger's head. "I know, Mr. Griff," she said, her voice full of a faith that could move mountains. "You always come back." He smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached the depths of his soul. "Yeah, kid. Always." As the men mounted up for the final time, the engines roared to life, but the sound was different. It wasn't a threat or a cry of rebellion. It was a salute, a final, powerful acknowledgement of the bond forged on this quiet street. Ranger barked once, a sharp, proud sound, and ran alongside them for a few last, symbolic feet before stopping at the edge of the property. He stood there, a silent, powerful sentinel, watching them go, his tail held high. Griff didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel it all, the laughter, the hope, the faint, papery rustle of Maya's note in his jacket pocket, and the echo of her words. They were part of him now, woven into the fabric of his being, as permanent as the scars on his knuckles. As they drove into the horizon, their shadows stretched long and endless across the sunlit road, a chain of men forever changed. The road ahead was open, but for the first time, Griff wasn't running toward something or away from something. He was simply driving, at peace with the man he had become. But as the roar of their engines faded, a question lingered in the quiet street. Could this fragile, newfound peace truly last forever? The change of season was a gentle turn, not a sharp cut. The first chill of autumn whispered through the trees on Willow Lane, brushing fingertips of cold air against the window panes of the little house that had become a sanctuary. Inside, the warmth was more than just the heat from the repaired furnace. It was a warmth that lived in the walls, breathed in the rooms, and shone from the faces of the people within. Sarah Walsh had found her footing. The job at the diner was steady, the tips were humble but consistent, and the simple act of providing for her daughter had restored a sense of purpose that had been stolen from her. She moved through their home with a new grace, no longer haunted by the ghost of what was, but building upon the foundation of what had been given back. Maya's laughter was the music of the house. She had started school again, her backpack filled with new pencils and a confidence that hadn't been there before. On the kitchen wall, next to the drawing of the wing jeep, was a new piece of art, a crayon family portrait. It showed three figures, herself, her mother, and Ranger, standing in front of a large, smiling sun with a familiar jacket. Underneath, in her careful script, she had written, "My family." The Vanguard's visits became less about work and more about connection. They were no longer rescuers. They were uncles, brothers, a part of the extended, unconventional family they had all forged. Some Saturdays, they didn't bring tools or supplies. They just brought themselves. Griff would sit on the porch with Sarah, sharing a cup of coffee, talking about nothing and everything. The conversations were easy, filled with comfortable silences that spoke of mutual respect and a shared, unspoken understanding of survival. Other vets would play with Maya in the yard, teaching Ranger new, useless but entertaining tricks, like balancing a biscuit on his nose or rolling over on command. The big, tough men would get down on their knees, their jackets scraping against the grass, completely engrossed in a game of fetch or patiently listening to Maya recount a story from her school day. One such afternoon, Davis, the young vet, was showing Maya how to check the tire pressure on his Jeep, using his own gauge. Her small hands struggled with the tool, but her focus was absolute. "See," Davis said, his voice patient. "When the needle is in the green, it means she's ready to ride safe." Maya nodded seriously. "Ranger needs checkups to be safe, too." The vet said so. "Exactly," Davis grinned. "Gotta take care of your family, whatever they look like." Near the porch, Mac was helping Sarah winterize the outside faucets, wrapping them in insulating foam. "Should hold through the first freeze," he grunted, giving the pipe a final, satisfied pat. "Thank you, Mac," Sarah said, her voice sincere. "I wouldn't even have known where to start." It's nothing," he mumbled, uncharacteristically shy under her gratitude. "You're doing the hard part. We're just the maintenance crew." He almost said angels, but the word still felt too foreign and holy for his rough tongue. The true symbol of this new, sustained peace was the Jax sunflower. It had grown towering and strong in the front yard, its heavy, golden head following the path of the sun each day. It had weathered summer storms and now stood defiant against the cooling air, a vibrant beacon of resilience. Maya was fiercely protective of it, watering its base long after the rest of the flowers had faded. As the group prepared to leave that evening, the days noticeably shorter, Maya stood by the sunflower, her small hand resting on its thick stalk. Ranger sat beside her, watching the men. Griff walked over to her. "That's one heck of a flower, kid." "It's the strongest one," she said proudly. "Just like you said." He looked from the sunflower to her face. Both turned toward the fading light. He saw no trace of the desperate, hungry child from the roadside. He saw a happy, loved little girl. The transformation was complete, and it was more beautiful than any sunset. The drive back to the warehouse was quiet, but the silence was no longer filled with the ghosts of the past or plans for a confrontation. It was filled with the quiet hum of contentment. They had not just saved a family, they had woven themselves into its fabric, and in doing so, had rewoven the frayed edges of their own lives. The story wasn't about a single dramatic rescue anymore. It was about this, the quiet, ongoing acts of presence, the proof that kindness, once offered, could become a permanent state of being. The rumble of their engines was now the sound of that promise being kept week after week, a lullaby of loyalty on the quiet suburban street. As the roar of their engines faded, a question lingered in the quiet street. Could this fragile, newfound peace truly last forever? Peace, Griff was discovering, was not a destination you arrived at, but a road you traveled. It had its own rhythms and its own subtle challenges. The frantic energy of the rescue had faded, replaced by the deep, quiet work of maintenance, of a house, of a family, and of his own spirit. He found himself driving to Willow Lane alone sometimes, on evenings when the warehouse felt too loud and the memories too close. He wouldn't always even go inside. Some nights, he'd just park his Jeep a few houses down and watch for a moment. He'd see the golden glow of the new kitchen light, the silhouette of Sarah moving by the window, Maya's small shadow dancing as she played with Ranger. It was a living painting of the life he'd helped save, and the sight of it was a balm he hadn't known he needed. One such evening, as he sat in the growing dusk, the front door opened and Sarah stepped onto the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. She didn't look surprised to see him. She simply lifted a hand in a slow, gentle wave, an invitation. He killed the engine and walked up the path, the crunch of his boots on the gravel a familiar sound now. "Everything all right, Sarah?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "More than all right," she said, her smile serene. "I saw you sitting there. Thought you might want a cup of coffee that isn't from a stained thermos." He accepted, and they sat on the porch steps, the same steps where he had first seen Maya braiding that ribbon. The house was quiet. Maya was already asleep. They sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the distant hum of a car and the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. "Ben tried to contact me," Sarah said suddenly, her voice calm but firm. At the mention of Ben's name, Griff went very still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Every muscle in his body was a coiled spring. "Where?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Through a letter. Sent to the diner." She took a slow sip of her own coffee. "He said he's in a rehab program, somewhere upstate. He said hearing about what happened, what you did from an old acquaintance, was the final push he needed." Griff remained silent, letting her talk, his jaw tight. He didn't ask to come back. He didn't make excuses. He just apologized. For the first time, it felt like a real apology. Not him feeling sorry for himself, but him being sorry for what he did to us. She looked out into the dark street. I wrote back. I told him I forgave him. Not for his sake, but for mine and Maya's. Carrying that anger was too heavy. She turned to look at Griff, her eyes clear and certain in the dim light. But I also told him that the life he walked away from is gone. The life he walked away from is gone, Griff. It's been rebuilt by better men. And he has no place in it. The tension slowly seeped out of Griff's shoulders. This wasn't a crisis. This was closure. Sarah wasn't a victim anymore. She was an architect, decisively drawing the final blueprints of her own life. Griff nodded slowly, a profound respect swelling in his chest. "You're a remarkable woman, Sarah Walsh." She smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression. "We all have our battles, Griff. You taught me that it's okay to have people in your corner. It's okay to let the angels in, even if they come wearing jackets that smell like motor oil." Inside, a floorboard creaked, followed by the soft pat of paws. Ranger nosed the door open and trotted out. He looked at Griff, then at Sarah, and then lay down solidly between them, his head on his paws, his body a living barrier of loyalty. His work was never done, but his vigilance was now a comfort, not a necessity. Griff finished his coffee, the simple, bitter brew tasting like acceptance. The last loose thread of the past had been tied off, not by his fists, but by the quiet strength of the woman he had helped save. The threat was truly gone, dissolved not by violence, but by grace. As he stood to leave, Sarah spoke again, her voice gentle. "You know, you don't have to sit out here in the dark, Griff. You're always welcome inside. Your family." The word landed in his heart and settled there, warm and real. Family. It was a word he thought he'd lost the right to forever. He just nodded, the emotion too thick in his throat for words. But as he drove away into the night, the wind on his face felt different, lighter. He wasn't an outsider looking in at a life he'd fixed. He was a part of it. The road ahead was no longer a solitary path, but one that always led back to a porch light left on for him. Winter arrived not with a blizzard, but with a slow, steady frost that silvered the world. The Jax sunflower in the front yard, once a tower of gold, was now a skeletal silhouette against the gray sky, its head bowed, its life cycle complete. But there was no sadness in its passing. It was a natural, dignified end, and its promise was stored in the seeds Maya had carefully collected in a small envelope for next spring. The house on Willow Lane was now a fortress against the cold, not just in its repaired walls and sealed windows, but in the atmosphere within. The smell of Sarah's homemade soup mingled with the scent of pine from a small, donated Christmas tree twinkling in the corner. It was their first tree in years, and its simple presence was a celebration. The veterans' visits became shorter, but more frequent, like tactical check-ins. They would arrive in a cloud of condensed breath and the rumble of engines, their jackets dusted with a fine, cold powder. They'd stomp their boots on the mat, their faces red from the wind, and be welcomed into the warmth with hot chocolate or strong, black coffee. Their purpose had shifted entirely. They came to receive as much as to give. They came for the light in Maya's eyes when she showed them a new school project. They came for the quiet, steady gratitude in Sarah's smile. They came to feel the simple, uncomplicated love of a dog who saw them as pack. One bitterly cold Saturday, a few weeks before Christmas, the entire crew was crammed into the small living room. The scene was a picture of surreal, heartwarming contrast. Mac, with his scarred hands and tattooed knuckles, was carefully hanging a delicate paper angel on the highest branch of the tree, following Maya's precise directions. Davis was on the floor, attempting to help Ranger wear a single, droopy red Christmas sock as a hat, much to the dog's patient bewilderment. Griff stood by the fireplace, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the flames. He watched the scene, his rough, hardened family mingling so naturally with this one they had saved. He saw the way Davis looked at Sarah, not with pity, but with a deep, abiding respect. He saw the way Mac's normally gruff expression softened when Maya talked to him. He saw the way Ranger moved through the room, touching each vet with his nose as if doing a head count, ensuring his entire pack was present and accounted for. This was the healing. Not the fixed roof or the full pantry, but this, the creation of a new, chosen family from the broken pieces of old ones. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of despair he had first encountered, but the comfortable, happy silence of people completely at ease with one another. Later, as the group prepared to brave the cold again, Maya approached Griff, holding the envelope of sunflower seeds. "These are for you," she said, her voice serious. "For your workshop, so you can have a strong flower too." Griff took the envelope. It was light in his hand, but the weight of its meaning was immense. It was a promise of future life, a symbol of hope she was now giving back to him. He crouched down, his knees protesting. "Thank you, Maya," he said, his voice husky. "We'll plant them right by the entrance. First thing in spring." She nodded, satisfied, then threw her arms around his neck in a quick, tight hug. "Drive safe in the snow, Mr. Griff." As the men filed out, pulling on their gloves and zipping their jackets, Sarah stopped Griff at the door. She handed him a small, neatly wrapped parcel. "It's not much," she said a little shyly. "Just a scarf. I noticed yours is looking a bit thin." He took the parcel, the simple brown paper rough under his calloused fingers, and knew it was a gift of care, not charity. It was a signal that the flow of kindness had reversed. They were now looking out for him, too. The drive back to the warehouse was bitingly cold, but Griff felt the new wool scarf, dark green, soft and sturdy, wrapped around his neck, a tangible shield against the elements. It was more than fabric. It was a flag of belonging. That night, in the stark utilitarian environment of the workshop, the envelope of seeds sat on his bench, a small, papery promise next to the wood stains and tools. The scarf was draped over the seat of his Jeep. These were not just gifts. They were proof. He had started this journey, thinking he was driving to save a starving child and her mother. He thought he was providing a rescue. He never imagined that, in the process, he would be provided for. He would be rescued in return. The hollow space inside him, carved out by loss and guilt, had not just been patched. It had been filled completely and irrevocably with the love of a family he never saw coming. The cold wind howled outside, but inside Jax Griffin, for the first time in a decade, it was finally unquestionably spring. Time, which had once moved with the painful, dragging weight of hunger and fear, now flowed effortlessly for the family on Willow Lane. It carried them through the rest of a mild winter and into a spring that arrived shyly, with soft rains and tentative buds. The world was waking up, and so were they, in a way they had almost forgotten was possible. The envelope of sunflower seeds remained on Griff's workbench, a silent, promised future. He'd look at it during long nights at the warehouse, a reminder that growth was coming, both in the earth and in his own life. The scarf from Sarah stayed on his Jeep, a permanent fixture, its green wool softened by miles and weather. One Saturday in early spring, the vanguard arrived not as a roaring convoy, but in twos and threes, a casual infiltration of the quiet street. There was no project to manage, no crisis to avert. Today's mission was simple: planting. Maya was waiting for them with a small, bright yellow gardening trowel and the precious envelope of seeds. Ranger stood guard over a bag of potting soil, his tail wagging a happy, dusty rhythm against the ground. "The ground is ready," Maya announced, pointing to a small, neatly turned patch of earth right by the warehouse's main entrance, a spot that caught the morning sun. Griff nodded, a smile playing on his lips. "Then let's get to work." What followed was a scene of profound, gentle absurdity. Large, capable men, their hands more accustomed to gripping steering wheels and power tools, knelt carefully in the dirt. They took turns, under Maya's exacting supervision, using her small trowel to dig precise, shallow holes. Davis, with a concentration usually reserved for engine blocks, gently placed a single black and white seed into each divot. Mac, his massive, scarred fingers surprisingly deft, carefully brushed the soil back over them. To plant a seed was an act of faith, a belief in a future they would all share. Griff pressed the seed into the earth, a silent promise to be here to see it grow. It was a ritual, a silent, sacred promise made to the future. Each seed buried was a testament to their collective belief that they would all still be here, together, to see it grow. That they would be there to watch the green shoots break through the soil, to see the stalks stretch toward the sky, to witness the eventual burst of golden petals. As they worked, the conversation was light, filled with the easy camaraderie that had become their new normal. They talked about upcoming projects, about the best routes for a summer camping trip, about nothing of great importance and everything that mattered. Sarah came out of the house with a pitcher of lemonade, and the men took breaks, drinking from the cool glasses, their dusty hands leaving prints on the sides. Griff watched the men work, a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the dust. This was his command now, not a battlefield, but this quiet patch of earth, this shared purpose. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in pastel shades, the group had left, and the newly planted garden was watered. Maya and Griff sat on the curb in front of the warehouse, watching the first stars appear in the periwinkle sky. Ranger lay between them, his head resting on Griff's boot, his body a warm, breathing weight. "Do you think they'll really grow?" Maya asked, her voice soft in the twilight. "They will," Griff said, his voice certain. "They're strong seeds. They just needed good ground to grow in." He wasn't just talking about the sunflowers. Maya leaned her head against his arm, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated trust. "I'm glad you stopped your Jeep that day, Mr. Griff." The simplicity of her statement took his breath away. That single, split-second decision to slow down, to look, to care, had rerouted the course of so many lives. It had saved a family from collapse. It had pulled a group of lost men from the brink of their own cynicism. It had given a dog named Ranger his forever home. And it had led him here, to this quiet curb, under a budding sky, with a child's head resting trustingly against him. "Me too, kid," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Me too." He looked up at the emerging stars, no longer cold, distant points of light, but friendly witnesses to a world that could still be mended. The past was finally, completely, at rest. It held no more power over him. The road behind him was just a road. The road ahead was a promise, lined with the seeds of golden flowers, and it was a road he would never have to travel alone again. The story ends where it began, on a road. But the road and the man upon it were forever changed. Summer returned, blanketing the world in a thick, warm haze. The air hummed with the sound of insects and the distant, lazy rumble of a single Jeep. Griff drove alone, the wind a familiar companion. But the solitude no longer felt empty. It felt chosen. The world looked different from his driver's seat now, softer, full of connections rather than just exits. He turned onto Willow Lane, and the first thing he saw was a wall of gold. The seeds they had planted by the warehouse had erupted into a glorious, towering row of sunflowers, their faces turned toward the sun, each one a vibrant echo of the first Jack sunflower. They were a living, growing welcome sign, a testament to the promise kept. As he pulled up, the scene that unfolded was the perfect, polished gem of his new life. Maya, now a little taller, her hair sun-streaked, was running through a sprinkler on the lush green lawn, her laughter mixing with the hiss of water. Ranger, ever her shadow, bounded alongside her, barking joyfully, his silver tag glinting. Sarah stood on the porch, not leaning on the doorframe for support, but standing strong and confident, a glass of iced tea in her hand. She waved, her smile easy and full of light. This was no longer a rescue. This was a homecoming. Griff killed the engine, and the sudden silence was filled with the sounds of life, Maya's giggles, Ranger's barks, the chirping of birds. He stepped out and simply watched for a moment, etching the picture into his soul. This was the peace he had spent a lifetime chasing on the open road, and it had been waiting for him here on a quiet street, in the heart of a family he helped build. Maya spotted him and ran over, dripping wet, her feet leaving dark prints on the warm pavement. "Mr. Griff, look how tall they are," she exclaimed, pointing at the sunflowers. "They're perfect, kid," he said, ruffling her wet hair. "Just like you." Ranger trotted up, nuzzling his hand before shaking his wet fur all over Griff's cargo pants. Griff didn't mind. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that was now a regular part of his vocabulary. Sarah walked down the path and handed him the glass of iced tea. "We were hoping you'd stop by today." The we was deliberate, inclusive. He was expected. He was part of the we. They sat on the porch steps, just as they had so many times before, but the stakes were gone. There was no crisis to solve, no secret to uncover, no enemy to face. There was only the simple, profound pleasure of each other's company. They talked about Maya's school year, about a trip to the beach Sarah was planning, about the new suspension Griff was installing. The conversations of a family. Later, as the afternoon began to wane, Griff knew it was time to go. The crew was meeting at the warehouse. There were no grand goodbyes, no dramatic speeches. Maya gave him a damp, heartfelt hug. Sarah squeezed his arm, her eyes saying everything words could not. "Drive safe, Griff. Always do." He climbed into his Jeep, the familiar vehicle, now an extension of a man who was finally whole. He looked back one last time. Maya was waving, her small hand a frantic blur. Sarah stood with her arm around her daughter, a picture of resilience and love. Ranger sat at attention beside them, his job complete, his family safe. Griff started the engine. The roar was the same, but the meaning had transformed. It was no longer a sound of escape, but a sound of return. It was the sound of a man who had found his way home. He drove away, not into the sunset, but into the golden, honeyed light of a summer afternoon. The sunflowers stood tall and bright in his rearview mirror, a permanent landmark on his personal map, a beacon he could always navigate toward. The screen held for a beat on this final image: the sunflowers, the waving family, and the loyal dog, a perfect portrait of peace. Then the narrator's voice returned, calm, wise, and final. "The world is full of noise, of engines and sirens and 1,000 distractions. But if you listen closely, beneath it all, you can sometimes hear the quiet hum of a miracle. It's the sound of a heart healing, the sound of a lost soul finding its way, the sound of a little girl's laughter, finally free from fear." This is a reminder that heroes don't always look the part. Sometimes they're just people who are brave enough to stop, to care, and to stay. Your act of kindness, no matter how small, could be someone else's miracle. So don't ever underestimate the power you have to change a life. The image was now fully black. The sound of Griff's Jeep engine echoed one last time, but it didn't fade into the distance. It simply hung in the silence for a moment, a powerful, enduring memory, before it too softly vanished.
If stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Bonds Unspoken. Every click helps us share more incredible moments that celebrate the bond between humans and animals. And be sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us what true loyalty feels like.